Hi, everyone. Nice to see you again. It's Michael Shermer. It's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show, brought to you by Wondrium. This is the teaching company's new name for its streaming service that you can listen to all their great content, engaging, educational short-form videos, long-form courses, tutorials, how-to lessons, travelogues, documentaries, and more streamed right into your phone. Like here's one I was just scrolling through the app, and every time I go there, there's a new course. Astonishing. It's like every day. This one's called A New History of the American South. I know a lot about history of the American South. I've took courses on that before. This is new. As you know, the Confederate flag still waves in some places, taken down in other places, very controversial. What in the world does that stand for? Why were all those statues from the Civil War still there in the 20th century? What? So let's look at this. This is 12 30-minute lectures. The geography of the American South, very different from the geography of the American North, also populated by different people from Europe, not the Native Americans. That's a whole nother course. The world of slavery, how slavery becomes American. The Southern colonies take root. The Southern states and the new nation, war, uprising, and Southern solidarity. The birth of the Cotton South. Evangelical faith in the South. Arguments for and against slavery, and so on. The life in the slave South. 24 lectures, the end of the war and slavery, Reconstruction, and all that in the late 19th century. Now we're into the 20th, segregation, lynching, and disenfranchisement, and on and on. It's a dark history that we should all learn. Not the 1619 Project, not the 1776 Project. Just, it's okay to have complexities in history. And that's one of the things I enjoy about Wondrium is they give these professionally produced courses taught by the world's leading experts in the field that give you all the nuance. It's never simple black and white. Anyway, check it out, Wondrium. If you do it through the show, wondrium.com/Shermer, you get 2 years for the price of one. Really, I'll just pause there. Just hit pause. Boom. Go over to, you have to listen to this, wondrium.com/Shermer, WONDRIUM/Shermer, and then subscribe, 2 years for the price of one, come back, and then hit play to listen to the next episode of the show. Thanks for supporting the show. Thank you to Wondrium for the support of the show. Much appreciated. Here's our next episode. I'm your host, Michael Shermer, the publisher of Skeptic magazine. Get your latest issue on economic matters at your local Barnes & Noble or independent bookstore or any of the chains that carry it, or go to skeptic.com/magazine and you can order it there, either the print edition. We're still in print. In fact, we're 4-color throughout. How cool is that? Ooh, look, Easter Island. Oh, meteor impacts. Okay. Or digital. Of course, you can read the magazine on your phone, on your iPad, or whatever you prefer. And if you care to support the podcast, you can do so through the Skeptic Society, which is a 501c3 nonprofit, so your donations are tax deductible. Go to skeptic.com/donate, and that's what sponsors the show primarily. Okay, my guest today is Matt Thornton, who's been teaching functional martial arts for more than 30 years. He holds a 5th-degree black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. His organization, Straight Blast Gym, has more than 70 locations worldwide and has produced champion MMA fighters as well as world-class self-defense and law enforcement instructors. He lives with his wife, Salome, and their 5 children in Portland, Oregon. His new book, here it is, The Gift of Violence, Practical Knowledge for Surviving and Thriving in a Dangerous World. Nice to see you, Matt. It's been a while since
it's been a while. Thanks
Portland.
For having me on here. It's good to see you too.
Yeah, likewise. And congratulations on the book. I really love the book. Of course, I blurbed it, so I guess I must have read it long ago when it was in manuscript form. It was good to revisit it. And so let's do this. Let's talk theoretical about violence and the evolution of violence, why it's there, and so on, and look at some of the different theoretical issues about how to make it decline even further. And then the practical ones. What can listeners take away from your training to protect themselves and their families? How's that sound?
That sounds good.
Yeah, before we do that, though, you start the first chapter with some autobiographical material, which I found quite interesting. So give us a little bit of background. How did you get into this? Where'd you grow up? And who were your parents and so forth?
Yeah, I grew up in a little town called Hollister, California, which most people don't know about. I think it's probably most famous because the Hells Angels took it over a long time ago. They made a movie about it with Marlon Brando. But I grew up there. My dad was a police officer, and he was lieutenant of the police department there. And my mom was a very dedicated Jehovah's Witness. So from a very early age, I was going to the Kingdom Hall and the Jehovah's Witness meetings and everything 4 times a week. And they are, for all intents and purposes, pacifists. So you couldn't be a police officer or join the military or do anything that involved carrying a weapon if you were a Jehovah's Witness. On the flip side, and I think, I'm grateful for this, that my father wasn't a witness, because on the flip side, I had my dad, a very practical man. I would say agnostic, maybe atheist, not very religious at all. Didn't really want to contradict my mom, but tried to instill his values for me as well. And so growing up and talking to the two of them about violence and watching what my father had to go through and hearing what my mother would say, there was definitely some internal conflict about what's right and wrong. And eventually when I got into junior high school and I hit that really awkward age and we moved to a larger town, I ran into some bullying, which happens so many people. I think so many people that get into martial arts get in for that reason initially. And my reaction to it was overboard. I just went, what I felt inside never changed, but I went from feeling fear to just sheer aggression. And it kept me from getting beat up again, but it wasn't the long-term solution for violence. And that, I think, maybe was one of the reasons why I was so fascinated with martial arts. Ever since I saw them, I knew they were there. I was fascinated. And the only other thing I'll say, which has kind of fueled my research and my career over the last 30 years, is what I was primarily interested in as it relates to martial arts. And this is where the skepticism definitely comes in, because I was interested in what works in a fight and what doesn't work in a fight. I wasn't interested in any of the cultural affectations or the mythology. I wanted to know what works and what doesn't work. And I wanted to figure that out. And that's what started me on my journey and eventually led me to found SBG and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and all the things that we teach today.
Your parental upbringing in half of a Jehovah Witness, that's pretty unusual. I think Jehovah Witnesses are not supposed to marry somebody outside of the faith, or if they do, that makes it a little difficult.
It's discouraged. I don't think you get disfellowship for it, so she wasn't kicked out of the church for it. And her whole family were dedicated Jehovah's Witnesses. She had 3 older brothers, and 2 of them were missionaries. So they had both married and gone to live in Hong Kong and South America and places like that. So that side of the family was completely embedded in the church. But I never, the way it works is if you get baptized as a Jehovah's Witness, which you're supposed to do as a young teen, so you dedicate yourself to their belief system. After that, if you do something that they consider inappropriate, then they can disfellowship you. I stopped going when I was about 12. Never set foot in a place like that again from 13 on, and I never got baptized. They would ask me, but I just didn't feel right doing it. And so I'm kind of untouchable in a sense. I'm not actually a Jehovah's Witness. I'm not a member of their church. So there is no disfellowship or anything they can really do. So they just tend to ignore you.
How come you stopped going?
Doubts, anger, doubts, watching the people's behavior as compared to what they were talking about doing and preaching and doing. And I think it helped in many ways inform how I think and my love for the scientific method and for epistemology and for all things that are practical, because I got to see the opposite. Their version of learning was you'd go in it, as you know, it's multiple days a week. So there's a Tuesday night Bible study, a Thursday 2-hour congregation where you get together. And then Saturday you go door to door. And then Sunday you have the big services and then also probably go door to door. So that's what the typical family is doing. And when you go and sit in the church, their method of learning is basically you would read a paragraph of the propaganda, whatever their interpretation of a particular scripture was. And then within that paragraph, at the bottom, there'd be a question. And within that paragraph was the answer. And you were just meant to highlight the answer and then go back and read it back to them. And that was what they considered thinking and learning. And after a while, I started to realize that really doesn't have anything to do with thinking and learning. I'm just memorizing. And the logic for the things they're saying just didn't hold up.
You mentioned you were angry. What were you angry about?
running into bullying, I think, when I was a kid, not knowing how to handle it. I talk about this a little bit in the book, but if you're younger and you get picked on, one of the reasons why I always tell parents and kids at my gym and other places, like if they get picked on in school and they need to fight back, you want them to fight back in every single case. You want them to fight. I don't care if they have a policy where the kid gets suspended for a week, then gets suspended for a week. I don't care what the teacher or the vice principal says. You make sure that kid fights back, because if they don't fight back and just wind up taking a beating, then it's psychologically damaging for young boys, and it happens all the time. And so I was kind of on that spectrum where I was just taking beatings until eventually I just realized, I just flipped and started administering them. But all that, I think, was going on around the same time, 11, 12, 13, and that's when I started to pull away from the church and discovered girls and other things like that.
That'll do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, bullying is pretty common. I was bullied. I mean, pretty much everybody at some point, particularly boys, gets bullied. But I guess with the mean girls do it in their own way. That's can be just as destructive. Yeah. What do you recommend to parents who, say, reading your book or coming to you and saying, my kid's being bullied? What do I tell them to do? I mean, short of, just punch the guy in the face. That's hard to do.
Yeah. Yeah. The first thing is to teach the child to be assertive. Well, you begin by talking about boundaries. What's an appropriate boundary? What's not an appropriate boundary? What people are allowed to do and what people are not allowed to do, adults and kids. And one thing people are not allowed to do is put their hands on you if you don't want them to have their hands on you. And they need to be raised with that value. I tell a story in the book about my daughter. I was actually giving a talk at a Skeptic's meeting one time a few years ago. And my daughter she was about 8 or 9 at the time, and she was sitting in the audience with my wife, and there was a guy next to her, grown man, who kind of put his hand on her shoulder, and then she kind of shrugged it off and got a little upset. And, the guy kind of looked at her, and I saw the whole thing from where I was because I was on the stage, and I viewed it harmless. I don't think he was a predator. But what made me happy was the way she reacted and the immediate reaction by my wife, which was to put her arm around her and completely support her in what she was doing. And I think she could have learned a terrible lesson had she been told not to do that or that she shouldn't do that. So once they have their boundaries in place and they understand those boundaries are important and they have that sense of right and wrong of what other people are allowed to do, then it's important to be assertive. And assertiveness comes more naturally for some people and not so naturally to others. But like anything else in this world, it can be trained. So you teach the kid to say what they feel out loud and to verbalize that. So if a child's running into bullying, the first thing they need to do is stand their ground and verbalize and say, hey, that's not okay. Hey, no, you can't do that. You talk. And it begins with talking in an assertive, comfortable with their, eye contact, shoulders back. And again, all these things can be trained. And if that's not working, then you tell a teacher, you tell an appropriate administrator. And if you've talked to them and told them to stop and you tell an administrator and it continues, then you take them down. You tackle them or you punch them, and you put the beautiful thing about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is the kids that train with me can take a bigger, stronger kid, put them on the ground, control them without hurting them. They don't have to just keep punching them in the face, and tell that kid to knock it off or they're never going to let them go. And it's only going to take one of those incidents, and then everybody else in the school is going to leave you alone. So there's steps along the way, so you're not just starting with punching them in the face. But it all begins with those boundaries and learning how to be assertive in a healthy way.
Yeah, I remember when my little guy, he's 7 now, he was maybe 3 or 4, I think 4, at the playground, and he's just the sweetest guy, and he wants to play with everybody. He's very generous, so some kid comes over and just takes his toy, I think it was a car or something, and just walks away, and my little guy comes over to me like, can you help me here? So I said, no, you just go over there and say, that's mine. Don't ever do that again. And he said, oh, okay. I mean, he didn't know what to say. And so I just made that up, and he walked over and said exactly that. Kid gave him back the toy, and that was the end of that. I thought, wow, that really works.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So in that sense, then, violence is a form of deterrence. Let me get the quote here from your mission of your Straight Blast Gym: to make good people more dangerous to bad people.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, the world is not going to Well, let me take a step back. Big long-term trends, of course, you've written about this, Steven Pinker's written about this, are good, and that every generation seems to, there's exceptions and spikes and things like that, but every generation seems to be a little less violent than the one that came before. And I know that the life I live with my wife and my kids is totally different from the level of violence that many of my ancestors had to deal with. But having said that, I don't think it's ever going to completely go away. And we're not going to wake up tomorrow and all of a sudden America or any other part of this world has all become magically safer. And there have always been bad people walking among us, people that if they see someone vulnerable and open and somebody that they can hurt, they will do it if there's no consequences or anybody else around. And so the only way and the best way to stay safe in those situations is to be dangerous. And if you're dangerous, then they're likely to leave you alone. And long-term consequences of training in a combat sport. So it's not a martial arts book in the sense that there's no pictures, and I'm not talking about that. That would be a different book. But I do talk about what works and what doesn't work in a fight and how to find a place and how to train in a way that is going to work practically for people. So if people decide to take up training, the recommendations of how to do that are in the book. But I'm always advocating for combat sports. The martial arts that work, the things that work against a resisting opponent are sports. They're judo, they're boxing, they're Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, they're Muay Thai. And the thing all those sports have in common is an opponent process and aliveness. And that is the martial arts epistemological version of the scientific process. And if you remove that, it won't work. But because sports care about the results, because people want to win, they maintain that kind of form of meritocracy. And because of that, they're all valuable. If somebody just fell in love with judo or somebody fell in love with boxing, by all means, just go train that particular combat sport. One of the long-term consequences of training for a few years is you will also start to carry yourself naturally in a way that's just going to be more assertive and more aware of your environment and look like less of a target. And predators, all predators, school shooters, no matter what, everybody looks for the weakest prey. They're lazy, and they're going to go to the most vulnerable place before they attack. And so if you look like you're not even capable of necessarily beating them, but look like somebody who will put up a fight, look like somebody who's not going to be easy, it's going to make noise, it's going to make it hard, they're going to move on to someone else. And as we talk about in the book and studies have shown, they're really good, they being predators, are really good at thin slicing and at making really quick judgments within a fraction of a second as to who they think is going to be good prey and who's not. And a lot of that is subconscious. A lot of that goes back to our evolutionarily evolved traits. But that ability, that assertiveness, that kind of radiate like I'm not going to be an easy target just happens kind of naturally from training in a combat sport. You don't have to fake it. You don't have to walk around. You're just like, if you just spent 3 hours in a boxing gym, or last weekend you were in a judo tournament throwing people around, just the way you walk down the street is going to be a little bit different from somebody who hasn't done anything physical since they were in, maybe high school.
How much of what you're doing is also teaching discipline like any sports or athletic activities competition would do? I've never done any of the stuff you do, but I'm really into sports. I played baseball and played tennis and professional cycling, and so on. And it's like, it really taught me to be strong, disciplined, organized, and just physically stronger. I don't know, fitter, whatever. Just
absolutely,
it fuels my mind better if I don't work out. I don't think as clearly in the rest of the day.
Yeah. So one of our priorities, and we talk about in the book, which was a statement I got from Paul Sharp, who's another one of our instructors, but it's so good. What we're here to do is make good people more dangerous to bad people. But what I've discovered after doing this for 30 years is making good people more dangerous to bad people can also make better people. So just the process of all the things you have to go through, if we talk about an art like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, or any combat sport, but I'll talk about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in particular. And people who aren't familiar with that would be the ground fighting portion of what they would see, for example, in the UFC. And it is impossible, literally impossible, to get decent at that art, let alone good, unless you have tapped out, like have been submitted, having submitted to your opponent hundreds and even thousands of times. And sometimes you're going to win and sometimes you're going to lose. But the losing isn't just okay. The losing is, as I always try and remind my students, it's an essential part of that process. And it's a pure meritocratic system. Nobody cares if you're a construction worker or you're a surgeon or how much money you make when you step on the mat. Whether you can do what you're capable of doing and not capable of doing will be immediately apparent, and you won't be able to fake it any more than somebody can fake speaking French or playing a guitar. Like, it sounds good until someone who actually speaks French comes in the room or somebody hands you a guitar. And combat sports are just like that. And so everything that you get, every piece of skill that you get from the sport, you have earned, and you've gone through trials. You've learned how to become more comfortable in very uncomfortable situations. And absolutely, those lessons carry over. Where don't they carry over? I mean, they become part of who you are, and they affect your relationships with other people and everything in a positive way.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about the evolution of violence. Why do we have violence wired into our nature? What was its purpose in the first place?
Yeah, I start with that in chapter 1, and I think it's important to remind people that, you know, we're animals, and just like every other animal, violence it can be an adaptive trait, and our ancestors weren't just okay at avoiding violence. Many of them were actually good at administering violence as well. And, you know, all of our ancestors, I'm sure, if we went through that unbroken chain of success that each of us has, and we forget how amazing that is because the others have all died off. But all of us have had ancestors who've had to murder and fight and go to war and do things like that as part of who we are. And I don't see that changing. So violence is as intrinsic to our nature as animals as reproduction or sex is. And just like we see when we talk about sexuality or reproduction, sometimes people take extreme views on it that are not so helpful. So they'll demonize and repress it on one end, like the pacifists I talk about in the book. And on the other end, you'll have people who will turn it into a fetish and romanticize it and use what I call boy speak, which is a lot of kind of male bravado around violence, what you might see in a Hollywood action movie, that type of view of violence. Neither of those, I think, are healthy. And so since this is part of who we are and this is part of what we have inside, I think logically, most of us should seek to have a healthy relationship with the topic. And a healthy relationship is not going to fetishize or romanticize violence, and it's not going to demonize or repress violence. I think we have to look at violence for what it is, see it for exactly how it is, and then get back in touch with that part of ourselves that our ancestors have.
Okay, so here's how I think about it. This is what I wrote in the moral arc about the evolution of violence. I start with Richard Dawkins' Selfish Gene, in which he talks about how a cell or body or an organism, a survival machine, is the gene's way of surviving and perpetuating itself. Genes that code for proteins that build survival machines that live long enough for them to reproduce will win out over genes that do not. Genes that code for proteins and enzymes that protect its survival machine from assaults, such as disease, help not just the organism to survive, but the genes as well. Survival, reproduction, flourishing, this is what survival machines do by their very nature. It's in our essence to strive to survive. The problem is that survival machines scurrying around in, say, a liquid environment like an ocean or pond will bump into other survival machines, all of whom are competing for the same limited resources. Quoting Richard, to a survival machine, another survival machine, which is not its own child or another close relative, is part of its environment, like a rock or a river or a lump of food. But there's a difference between a survival machine and a rock. A survival machine is inclined to hit back if exploited. And then Richard continues, this is because it too is a machine that holds its immortal genes in trust for the future. And it too will stop at nothing to preserve them. So in a way, violence then just begins at that most basic level, that
Absolutely.
that somebody else will try to exploit you, not because they're evil or they hate you, just that's what they're programmed to do.
That's exactly it. I couldn't possibly say it better than that. It reminds me as well, when I began the process to write this book, I sent a questionnaire. I had about 100 questions, and I sent them to maybe 100 and some odd people who all had extensive experience with violence. And I would ask different questions in there. I was curious what they thought about, what still bothered them, what questions they had about the topic. And one of the best answers I got back, which lends itself to the title of the book, The Gift of Violence, which is a bit provocative, and people, of course, ask why it's a gift, came from a former Navy SEAL friend of mine who said very simply, what greater gift can you give someone than freedom from exploitation by physical means? And that's exactly right. And so power, real power in our world has always belonged to people who can threaten security or take security. And that's where it all begins. So we have to have a base there so that we can keep ourselves and the ones we love safe.
Yeah. I also wrote about Christopher Boehm's research on hunter-gatherer groups that use deterrence. And first they start with gossip and then deterrence and various means all the way up to capital punishment to deal with bullies and free riders.
Yeah.
So one question is, how come natural selection didn't select out all the free riders, bullies, psychopaths, and just nasty people that don't like to play by the rules? Because we don't have that. We still have that, like maybe 1% to 3% psychopaths. People are just naturally violent. And why isn't it zero?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm not sure I know the answer to that. But what I would say is there are times when it is an effective strategy. There's no way you can get around that. There are times when it's definitely an adaptive strategy, when homicide will work, for example, to solve particular problems. And in today's evolved society where we have our culture and we've ceded that to law enforcement and we have police and we have all those things, it's not a good strategy for success. Crime doesn't really pay. And anybody who's extremely violent is probably going to have a miserable life eventually, and they wind up in prison for the rest of their life, especially now in 2023. But short term, for people who are just thinking very, very short term, and one of the things with that prefrontal cortex and people that tend to be extremely violent, especially if they're reactive, aggressive people, is a lack of impulse control. So they're not thinking about, they a lack of self-awareness, a lack of impulse control, a lack of empathy in the sense that they don't care or try and put themselves in the shoes of their victim. And when you put all that together, they're not going to be thinking about what's going to work in the long run. They're just going to go for what they can get, how you can get something immediately now. And so I think as long as there's people out there who have that wiring where they just have to have what they have to have in that moment, then we're going to have violence. We're going to have people using that strategy, even though over long term it may not work. And the other thing I would say to that too, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, but violence is also a way that men wind up having sex. And if a culture values being aggressive and frightening off any other predators or prey around, or being skilled in violence, or at least appearing to be skilled in violence, and that is rewarded with more opportunities to procreate, then what do we think is going to happen in 2 or 3 generations? And that gets, I say violence is intrinsic to our nature, and deep down, that's both for men and women. And there's a long history of women who would choose violent, scary predators as mates for all the reasons that our ancestors that would have been a great strategy, at various times through our evolution. And I think that's still part of it too. I think there's a level of sexual selection that goes on, especially with the younger kids who are just entering into maturity and they're 12 or 13 and they can't think of anything else. And then they get rewarded with more attention from women and from girls for those violent actions. They're going to commit those violent actions.
But here you probably mean women selecting for dangerous men that can control their violence. They don't want them to be violent, but they don't want to be violated by other men. And a dangerous man who loves them and protects them then will stand up to the dangerous men, danger to the women.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the healthy version of it. But just like anything else, I think that there's a shadow side to it too, where, there is a small selection of women who I think actually would choose somebody who's a violent person and maybe not even understand or that about themselves. But I don't think overall, I think you're absolutely correct, but I think sometimes those things get just as animals, those things get wired the wrong way, and those impulses wind up coming out in a way that's not going to be healthy or productive.
Oh, you mean so like rape? Most men are not rapists,
No,
but it's not zero.
right.
And so the Boehm's answer to the question I asked you, it gets to another passage you had in the book quoting, I think it was Jerry Coyne. It's not survival of the fittest; it's survival of the fitter.
Yeah.
Natural selection is not designed as to be perfect, just good enough to survive and get our genes into the next generation. So Boehm's answer is, you can have a relatively stable society that's successful with the 1% to 3% psychopaths, bullies, free riders, and so on. If it was 25% or 50%, it would fall apart and you'd have to do something. But we can all kind of grind along with a handful of these people over here. That's what we have police for, or dangerous people to handle that. But it's never going to be zero.
Right.
And so knowing that kind of allows us to say, oh, all right, yeah, okay, so this is why it's happening. There's a kind of an underlying logic to violence.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly it works well, but you can't. It's not going to be perfect.
Right.
It's not. We're not striving for utopia because that's not possible.
Yeah, and Bob Hare, when he was been writing about psychopaths and sociopaths and things like that as well, though that percentage exists, the vast majority of that percentage is not violent either. And I think they've done studies where some of them can become very successful stockbrokers, or certainly my guess would be politicians. So that why does that 1% exist? I think that 1% exists because under the right circumstances, the traits of being a sociopath can probably, benefit the organism in some cases.
Kevin Dutton's book, I forget the title, it's like Positive Psychopathy, something like that. He's a psychologist, so he studied psychopathy. He agrees with what you just said. Basically, most of them they're in competitive jobs where you want somebody who is fearless. Doesn't care what other people think. The CEO of the Fortune 500 company, whose job it is just to make as much money for his shareholders and so on. And Kevin also worked with special forces in the UK. He has this great story of like the final screening. They've already screened out 99% of the people can't do this job. But in the final test, they got this guy in there. He's blindfolded. He's face down on the ground, and they fire up this big truck engine next to him, and then they take a tire that they've rolled over here and they roll it right up to his face and like right up on his head to see if he flinches, right? And the guy that doesn't flinch is like, that's the badass we want. He passes. Right? That's who you want when you're going to send somebody, special forces, into some foreign country that's dangerous.
Yeah.
Not somebody who's empathetic and sympathetic and kind and soft. And so there's a useful role for these kinds of people, and most of the time. There
is. I'll tell you a funny story about that too. It actually kind of made me feel better after I heard this, but I was talking to some of the guys who were in the SEALs, and they were the trainers, and they're looking for, that level of resilience and toughness and all that as you go through training, but they also have an eye out for someone that might just be a true sociopath or true psychopath, because it's not in anybody's interest to teach them those skill sets. And it's kind of an unspoken thing they have between them. But when the instructors would find somebody that they thought was a true psychopath, they were usually great. So they were doing super well on all the tests. They were performing at the top of the class, but the instructors are looking at each other and like, do we really want to train this person? I don't think this is somebody we want to train. So they have one little portion of the test that's off camera, where they can choose to fail someone if they decide to, as it relates to a drowning incident. And when that person got to that point, that person would always fail out. And it's not written, and it's, you're not going to find any regulations somewhere, but it's kind of an unwritten code that they had. And actually, after he told me that story and I started to think about it, I was actually quite grateful that the men who do that job have that aspect, are thinking that long term.
And I was also going to bring up David Buss's research on, what was his book, The Murder Next Door.
Yeah, The Murder Next Door.
Yeah, here it is. So he starts off by asking, have you ever thought about killing someone? And it turns out almost everybody has. What was it, 80% of men and 91% of men and 84% of women reported having had at least one vivid homicidal fantasy in their life. I mean, this was astonishing.
Yeah.
And so he provides some of these where, for example, one man who acted on these fantasies from a group of Michigan murderers whom Buss studied, said he killed his girlfriend because I was deeply in love with her, and she knew that. It infuriated me for her to be with another guy. Jealousy is a common motive, as evidenced by another case in which a man flew into a jealous rage during sex with his wife. According to him, she asked him, "How does it feel to fuck me right after someone else has?" He strangled her to death in bed. The impetus behind jealousy is not hate, Buss says, but love and attachment. As in this police confession by a 31-year-old man after stabbing his 20-year-old wife to death when she confessed to having sex with another man during a 6-month separation. I told her, "How can you talk about love and marriage and you've been fucking this other man?" I was really mad. I went to the kitchen and got the knife. I went back to her room and asked, "Were you serious when you told me that?" She said, "Yes." We fought in the bed. I was stabbing her. Her grandfather came up and tried to take the knife out of my hand. I told him to go and call the cops for me. I don't really know why I killed the woman. I loved her. So jealousy is a huge
Jealousy
trigger.
would definitely be one of those motives. Yeah, for sure.
But why would that be? So Buss argues it's mate guarding, right? If you get cuckolded, if you're a guy and your job is to get your genes in the next generation, and you get cuckolded and you end up raising somebody else's child, that's counterproductive for natural selection.
Right. It's all, the evolutionary psychology view on all of this, and especially violence, has always made a great deal of sense to me. That's not what the book's about. I talk a very little bit about it to try and get to the core of it and then talk about solutions. But David Buss's work and the rest of it, but also that's why I have to be careful, because something can make a lot of sense and then wind up not actually being the actual driver. But I think in this case it is, and I think it's pretty obvious. Women need mates that are going to protect them and protect their offspring and protect them from predators and other people. And men need to be able to fight off mate poachers and protect their offspring and protect their women and make sure that the other people aren't coming in and stealing their resources by having children with the women that are under their care. And there is a logic to violence most of the time. There's always those horrible circumstances where none of us can wrap our minds around why something happened, and that does occur. But very often, it is a logical chain of events that lead up to that violent attack or assault.
So your book is titled "The Gift of Violence." I take it as a play a bit on Gavin de Becker's book, "The Gift of Fear."
Yeah.
And here, talking about women, they are pretty finely tuned to nonverbal language of men around them, because they have to be. They're just by definition not as strong and big and so forth. So women have to be more risk averse than men do.
Yeah, one of the things I talk about in the book, one of the points behind the book, which goes back to Gavin de Becker's work, and when I decided I was going to write a book on this topic, I read a great deal for a couple of years. I read most of the material that was on the market to make sure that nobody else had written what I was going to say or done it better. And by far, the best book that I read was The Gift of Fear, and his follow-up book, Protecting the Gift, about children, is also fantastic. I think every parent should read that book. But his thesis is very simple, and that's, because we're evolved primates, we have within us these, I call them primal instincts, that will let you know when there's a predator or somebody around. And in almost every case, the victim of a particular assault or attack will say at the beginning that they felt it all of a sudden happen and they were shocked, and that there they were. But through asking the right questions, you can find out that there's a chain of events that preceded that. And the other person, the victim themselves, often had all kinds of internal signs and signals that they were rationalizing away because they don't want it to be true. They're in denial. They don't want to think bad of people. They don't want to be racist. There's a million different reasons, but they have this internal dialogue trying to rationalize away their instincts. And that is extraordinarily dangerous. And so one of the things I want people to do is get in touch with those instincts and to listen to those instincts. And those instincts, like you just said, are going to be different in some ways with women for all the reasons that you mentioned. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is if you have a female friend or a wife or a daughter or somebody like that, and she tells you that this guy is giving off, bad signals that she doesn't appreciate, you may not notice anything at all. I may not see anything at all, but anytime a woman says something like that to me, I take it very seriously, and I cast a different, more careful and pay more attention to that, whoever that particular person is, because they will definitely notice things that we don't, and vice versa. So I think it's really important for us to listen to other people when they start talking about that.
What's the ratio of men to women that come to your gym for training, and what is their motives?
Yeah. I'm proud to say that right now, I would say probably between 30 and 40% of my gym is female, and I have 750 so members in my Portland location. It wasn't always like this. So, we've evolved to that point. When I, for most of the first 10 or 15 years I taught, I had less than 100 people. They were all in their early 20s to early 30s, all fighting. And if you were to walk in, you'd see like 20 guys with their shirts off and rash guards and rolling around on the ground, punching each other and grappling. And it would be terrifying for the average person to walk to the gym. I have a window in my office where I can see, it's one-way window, and I can see people walking up to my door here at the gym. And for years, I would sit here in the daytime doing my work, and I would watch people with their training bag in hand walk to the front door of the gym, go right about to open up the door of the gym, and then they would turn around and walk away. And I realized that people are plagued with so much anxiety. Sometimes that people just have terrible social anxiety, but also fear about that. And so one of the things we really tried to do is create a system where a culture where people will always feel welcome. They'll feel comfortable. They're not going to be scared to try it, because I really do think it's good for everybody. And it works. And it turns out women love jiu-jitsu just as much as men. And one of my coaches here is in his mid 70s, and I've got a very successful MMA fight team here as well, and everything in between. And my wife and my daughters train, and we have kids training. And as far as how well they do, my experience over the decades has been women learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu actually quite a bit quicker than men. The technical aspect of it, they're easier to coach. Female athletes in general tend to be easier to coach than male athletes, because there's not as much ego applied to winning and losing that you have to get past, and it can just be more practical. You explain something and why something would work, and they're like, okay, and then they do it. They don't make that mistake again. Whereas a male athlete, if he thinks he can get away with it against a particular opponent, even if it's long term, it's going to be a mistake for them, will often continue doing it. As far as why, same reasons. Almost everybody that signs up at the gym, because we interview everybody, and it's not just at my gym, but all our gyms around the world. We interview everybody when they come in, and most people, vast majority of people, come in because they want to learn self-defense and they want to get in shape, but they want to they're scared, and they want to be able to defend themselves if the need arises. And that motive has only increased based on what's happened here over the last 3 years, especially here in Portland, where our shootings and our homicides have tripled, and the homelessness and violent assaults and attacks in the city all the time that weren't there prior to 2019, and so even more so. But they come in and they become interested in self-defense. They want to try it. We have a way of building them up, so we're building up weak people rather than weeding them out. It's really easy to make strong people stronger. The real art is to make weak people stronger. And so we work with them, we build them up, get to a certain point, and then what happens most often, after 6 months or a year and a half, they fall in love with the sport itself. They just fall in love with jiu-jitsu. It becomes cathartic, and they get stressed if they don't get a roll in that week, and it also becomes a part of their social culture, their friends, everything else. And then once that happens, then they're hooked for life.
Oh, I totally understand that. If I don't get a ride in, I'm just anxious the whole day.
Absolutely.
And it's made worse by Strava, because I can see what everybody else that I follow is doing that day. It's like, damn, I got to get out there. So it's, having that social aspect. Okay. But listening to that inner voice, that kind of instinctive, there's something odd about this guy. How do you fine tune that through training? I mean, you don't want your women, clients to be macing every other guy that walks by, but on the other hand, you don't want them to get sucker punched or whatever. How do you know when you're being paranoid versus you're being accurate?
Yeah, I think our instincts are far more evolved and much better than most people realize, and they're quite accurate and very sophisticated. And that's what I call primal instincts, the unconscious ones, not the conscious situational awareness of knowing what to look for and not look for, but just that own internal voice. And people will begin getting the fight or flight response long before they make contact with a particular predator out in the street. And learning to know what that is and to feel it and to listen to it is really all you need to do. And so what you have to worry about there is a signal to noise ratio. And if you're paranoid and you've got too many thoughts going around in your head rather than being present in the moment of what's going on, you're less likely to pay attention to those instincts than if you're not. Well, at the same time, if you're walking around with rose-colored glasses on and anytime those instincts come up, you want to repress them or you want to ignore them, then you will also be in trouble. So learning what they are, learning what they feel like, and just listening to them is really all people have to do in the beginning. And by getting educated, when we talk about the conscious awareness of what's going on around you, things to look for and not look for, like what Gavin Becker calls pre-incident indicators, those are fairly easy to teach to people. They're pretty common sense. As one of my police officer friends that's a coach here at the gym says, JDLR, it just doesn't look right. You look at a situation and you're not exactly sure why yet, but something just doesn't look right. So then you look a little more and you say, oh, here's somebody, why is he wearing a jacket? It's 110 degrees outside. Or why are those two guys in the car parked across from the convenience store, even though all the spots in the convenience, things like that. And the more people, those things are pretty easy to learn. And I talk about a lot of them in the book. I think I give people all the main ones that they need. And once they learn that, that will also help because it helps reduce that signal to noise ratio. They'll know what's not paranoia and the things that you really need to pay attention to.
Yeah, you have a list here in your chapter on the importance of noticing, to look at the face, hands, waistline, and then back to the face, and then the environment.
Yeah, that's just a general scanning technique. So if I'm looking at someone in the street, what am I looking for? For example, someone's walking towards me. And the first thing I don't want to stare at people, but you also don't want to not look at them at all and be afraid to let them see that you see them. Sometimes just a predator just knowing that you've clocked them is enough where they're going to pick somebody else. So you look at somebody's facial expression, and we get so much information from that, even just a brief second, because we're so good, most of us, at being able to read all kinds of emotions and intent behind people's expression. So you look just for a second. Then, of course, I'm just looking, are they wearing anything on their person and what's in their hands? Primates are going to hurt you with their hands and their teeth. What are they carrying? Are they hiding their hands or their hands in their pocket? That kind of thing. And then just briefly back up at the face. And the reason why I look one more time back there is just to see if they noticed, I noticed them, and if that made a change in their demeanor, and then go about my day. And from that point forward, you can kind of, if it just doesn't look right, you can kind of keep an eye on them in your peripheral vision, and if necessary, make space. Because at the end of the day, the physical solution to all violence, no matter what kind, at a macro level and a micro self-defense level, is managing and controlling distance. And if you can manage and control distance, you can manage and control the conflict. And in order to do that, you, of course, have to be aware of what you're supposed to stay distant from.
So making that eye contact without staring is a signal to them, I see you.
I see you. I see you. Just real quick. And it's not in a way, it's not in a way that's meant to be provocative or intimidate. It's different from if I was looking at somebody and I was, trying to intimidate them. Just a quick look up and down, and then that's it. It takes a fraction of a second.
Yeah. Yeah, my little guy and I were walking just through a little mall here across the street from the office, and there's a Big Five and a CVS. There's a lot of people around. But there was some woman sitting on the bench. She had her cell phone, but then I couldn't tell if she was talking to the phone or just talking to the sky, and she seemed a little out of it. And then as Vincent and I walk by, she's like, says something like, idiot, like staring at us. And then so I just ignored her and we continued. And then my little guy goes, why did she say that? She sounded so mean. And then I thought, yeah, that's right. His instincts, I think, were like, there's something wrong with it. And then when we came back, he was really watching her. So I put him on my right side, myself between him and her. And then I kind of eyeballed her. And then we just walked straight past her and she was still mumbling. I couldn't tell. What if she's mentally ill? What's the difference between somebody who's kind of nasty or whatever, could be dangerous, probably not, but mentally ill, unpredictable.
Yeah. That's the problem when you're dealing with mental illness. And, the reality is just and anybody, people that don't believe me, go on a ride along with your local police officers in your department or whatever. You're going to see that there's a sizable percentage of the homeless population that is dealing with severe drug use and or mental illness. And I don't know what the long-term social solutions are to that. I do think we need to be, when we see people are going to be a danger to themselves and other people, I think we need to get better at being able to put them in places like hospitals where they can be looked after. But just the truth is, I can walk out the street here in Portland and walk down a block, and there'll be 2 or 3 homeless people. I know who they are. Everybody else in the neighborhood knows who they are, and they've already assaulted a dozen people. We've got a guy here in the neighborhood in my gym that everybody knows, and he's attacked like 8 people. Big dude, homeless guy. Sometimes he seems to be okay, and maybe he's on his medicine. Sometimes he's not. So the big problem with those situations and why they scare people is you can't read them the same way. And I think that's what happened potentially in the Neely situation as well, as tragic as that was. If you're dealing with a violent criminal actor who's after your wallet or something like that, there is a logic to it that you can kind of know where that line's going to be and where it's not going to be. Whereas somebody that's suffering from mental illness, they're seeing and hearing something completely different from the scene that you're actually in, and they might all of a sudden lash out at you, and so it can be very scary for people.
You're talking about the New York subway case.
Yeah, that's what it sounded like to me. Is I don't know, and I don't think we have enough information yet. I don't have enough information yet to feel comfortable talking too much about it. But from what I've seen, it sounds like he got on there. He was acting very erratically. He was acting in a threatening manner, enough so that I think at least half a dozen people wound up calling 911. And then these 3 people decided to intervene. And it's a tough call, because what do? Do you wait until the person actually lashes out? There's all kinds of footage we can see out there in the news of, people in the street just literally just walking by an elderly person or something like that and pushing them in front of a bus, or stabbing them, or cutting them, or hitting them with a stick, just random violent attacks that are happening to people. And how do you know when somebody's going to do that? It's very difficult to tell if they're suffering from mental illness. So that makes everything more complicated. The answers are still the same. The answers are to be aware of it and to make distance and to keep distance and maintain it. But knowing where to draw that line when it comes to actual physical force can definitely be tougher.
Well, because of the outcome, his death, the Marine is now controversial. Had the Neely not died, then it would have been, oh, he's a hero to stop the violence, but everything's okay, but it's not because he's dead. So now what? Well, we don't know. And I guess there's more footage still we haven't seen yet that might help. But how hard is it to take somebody down, put them in a chokehold, and not kill them?
Yeah, I get asked this. I get asked this quite a bit, and I've actually been asked to be an expert witness on a number of cases when it comes to things like this, and I've always avoided it. And one of the reasons why I've avoided it is, it's very easy for me to say, having done jiu-jitsu for 30 years, yes, take that person, I can hold them down forever. There's nothing they're going to really do about it. And if I want to put on a choke, I can put on a choke and gently put them to sleep. And a choke this is one of the sad things about this too, because it is of all the ways you can end a conflict. If you're dealing with somebody who you truly have to put away or they're going to keep hurting you, the most humane thing you can possibly do, and the thing that's the most reliable, is apply a blood choke. You don't have to bash them in the head until they go unconscious. You don't have to break their arms. You apply a blood choke in 1,000, 2 1,000. Before I said 3 1,000.
You mean the carotid arteries here?
Yeah. There's various kinds, but a choke where you're cutting off the arteries. Before I get to 3, they'll be unconscious. 1,000, 2 1,000, and then they're unconscious. And if you let it go, they'll wake up, which happens all the time around the world in, grappling academies where we try not to put people to sleep, but sometimes people don't tap in time and they wake up. I've never seen it not happen. If you hold it indefinitely, you can definitely kill them. So tactically and technically, is there a way that can be done? Yes. Here's why I avoid and why I've never wanted to be a witness in those cases. The flip side of that is there is no safe way to have a physical conflict with someone and try and subdue someone or deal with them in a fight. There's no safe way. Every day, people die all around the world from getting punched once. There's a website, One Punch Knockout, I think. I can't remember what it was, but they track it. And often it's because people fall and hit their head, but not always. And you could hit I could take someone down and they could die. I could be holding them and they could have a state of excited delirium and die. And the other people around might think I was the one that did it, or that, the way I was holding them was responsible. So I really loathe to second guess people like the Marine and the other two men who, for all intents and purposes, it seems to me they were good Samaritans. And although it was a tragic situation, the flip side of that is how many times have we seen people assaulted, women raped, things like that going on in trains, and people just stand around or film it. I've seen that happen over and over again. And so encouraging other citizens to stand up for each other, to me, that's not being a vigilante. That's being a good citizen. It's what it seems like they did. Did he die from the choke? I don't know. Did the Marine hold the choke? I mean, some people have said 5 minutes. I don't know. I'd have to see the video on that. I've never seen, I believe they let him go when they got to the next stop. And I don't think there's a stop in New York that's 5 minutes away from the other one. So there's all kinds of questions I don't know the answer to, and I'd want to see the video. But you could do everything right and still wind up accidentally killing somebody.
But back to your comment about practicing every day, and you've done this 1,000 times. You've tapped out. You've tapped people out, thousands of times. You're just used to it. So the fact that he's an ex-Marine, well, maybe he hasn't grappled with anybody in 5 years, and it's just all of a sudden you're on the ground, and you and I can talk about it, or read about it in the newspaper. Well, why didn't he do this? Well, you're not in that situation with just massive adrenaline and just forward panic and.
That is exactly right. There's massive adrenaline, panic, everything if you are trained. And I think sometimes people have a misconception that didn't serve in the military, that there's some extensive hand-to-hand training that you get when you're in the Marines, or there's not. I mean, they have gotten better. There's been some people who've really done a great job of bringing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and functional martial arts, especially to our special operations soldiers. So they get a healthy dose of jiu-jitsu, but not the first belt you get in jiu-jitsu is called a blue belt. It usually takes about 2 or 3 years. They don't have anything near that level of training unless they pursue it on their own. Same thing with police officers. They'll get a couple hours, literally a couple hours total, of how to deal with someone in a hand-to-hand situation, and that is it. And if they're lucky, they'll get a couple hours of training a year, unless they seek it out. And I think the smart officers, and I can't imagine doing that job and not doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu on a regular basis. I can't wrap my mind around that. But the vast majority of police officers, the vast majority of soldiers, the vast majority of special operations operators have very, very limited amounts of actual hand-to-hand combat. And like I said, it's very, people die in physical confrontation all the time. So it's just very hard to say.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And also a lot of the times these cops are just sitting in the car doing nothing. So they go from low heart rate, resting, and then within 30 seconds, they're at the, all-time high of adrenaline, stress, and there's can't be much reason and rationality there. It's like those descriptions of a mass public shooting or shootout between the police and a perpetrator with a gun. And you read about it, and it goes on for pages and pages. It takes like 15 minutes to read the whole account of it. Then you see how long it lasted, like 6.5 seconds. Yeah. And when it's deconstructed in the courtroom, it's like, well, how come you didn't go left here and then shoot him in the leg instead of what you did? It's like, what, you can't even ask the question why. I mean, it's like, I wasn't thinking at all.
That particular comment about shoot him in the leg that was one of the most egregious things I've seen anybody, especially at the level of responsibility that President Biden has, say about violence. Is just such a stupid comment. And to be in public service for so many decades and to be making policy on how police officers, what they can and can't do, and to think that shooting someone in the leg is a viable strategy is deeply disturbing to me. So I hope that immediately some aides got around him and tried to, but I've seen him say it a couple other times since then. So I'm at a loss on that one.
Yeah. And so, I always wonder, why do the police have to respond when the suspect runs? Is it like, well, if we let him go, I mean, often they know where he lives. They
Yeah.
can just go pick him up later. Like the case of, I forget the guy's name that was asleep in the Wendy's line,
Mm-hmm.
drive-through line in Atlanta, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
And you got all the video, the body camera, and this goes on for like 45 minutes. They're talking to the guy. They know who he is. They know where he lives. And then they say, well, okay, we're going to have to, uh, cuff you here. And then he takes off.
Mm-hmm.
And then they run him down and it ends up shooting, he's dead. Well, why didn't they just let him go? Just pick him up tomorrow or something. I don't know what the police policy is on these things. I don't know.
Different departments have different policies on that, and they've gone. Both those things have been tried in different places. Chicago, under Lori Lightfoot, put in a policy where they're not engaged in those kind of chases. There's a cost either way. So yes, you could go pick him up. Yes, you probably know where he lives. The cost that's going to occur to society is if that becomes standard operating procedure for the police, is it's just going to encourage more violence, more mayhem, and then when there's a cop around, they're just going to run. They're just going to take off because they know that they can't be chased. And you're going to see what we've seen now. This is one of the problems with the shooting him in the leg and these kind of policies that are made about public safety, where they put feeling good above being right. You actually end up doing more harm than good. And we've seen that with the BLM movement and what's happened in post-George Floyd, what's happened to law enforcement. And violence is, many cases, has tripled. There's been a doubling of homicides in the Black community. Places like Chicago and Baltimore and St. Louis are basically war zones. And so there is a price to be paid as well for telling police officers to not be proactive, not having officers on the street pulling cars over, taking guns out of cars, pulling over gang members, actually operating as members of the community within that community, and instead pulling back has a huge cost to it that's going to be paid in blood by fellow citizens. So it can be tough to make those kind of decisions. At the end of the day, in my personal opinion, I think the more proactive the police are, the safer everybody is. But and I think that's been proven true, and we saw that happen in New York when they cleaned up that city. And I think that we know what to do. We're just at a place right now culturally where those solutions aren't politically correct at the moment.
Do you have an opinion on the George Floyd move that the cop made? Chauvin put his knee on the back of the neck, and is that a legitimate way to restrain somebody? Should he have done something different?
Can be. I think the main thing in that particular situation, so years ago, a lot of the departments made it illegal to hog tie people. So hog tying is where you have somebody's hands behind their back and their ankles, then you connect them so they're belly down. And what had happened is people had died. So they're laying on their belly, and just from laying on their belly, especially with stress and all the adrenaline you talked about, and then let alone whatever controlled substances are flowing through the bloodstream or fentanyl or who knows what, methamphetamine, and then they wind up unable to breathe and expand their rib cage, and they would die. And there have been several situations where people have been hogtied and thrown in the back of cars, belly down, and they died. And so the procedure then became turn them on their side. And so what I found unusual about the George Floyd situation is they had him belly down. Of course, there was 3 officers involved. You only really get to see Chauvin from the angle that most people see with the camera. But why they didn't stop and put him on his side sooner, I don't know. But the flip side of that is, what was his actual training? And from my understanding in that department, what he did and having them belly down in that particular position was something that he'd been trained to do. So that's another question to ask. If that's what we're telling the officers to do, we need to take a hard look at that as well.
Maybe it's not practical to train hundreds of thousands of police, or however many there are in the country, through your program. But that seems like what they need to do. The problem is, if you don't keep up with it constantly, like going to the shooting range with your gun, then it's probably not going to be practical.
A very tiny amount of solid Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training, let's say 2 hours a month, okay, 30 minutes a week, or an hour a week at most, will make a massive difference in how officers handle those situations. And it'll be much safer for the officer and much safer for the people being arrested. And one of the sad things about what's happened recently is one of the first things to get cut when the budgets of these departments are cut or where they're understaffed because everybody's retiring and no one wants to be an officer anymore, whatever the situation is, which is happening in LA and Portland and Seattle and San Francisco, is the first thing that gets cut is training. That's the first thing that gets cut from the budget. And even if they do have training in the budget, they don't have the officers to be able to rotate out to go and train. So I know the officers here in Portland really want to train, but they're so understaffed that to pull one or two out during the day or the evening to come in and do some training is taking them directly off the street and directly away from going from 911 call to 911 call, which is all we have the staff for right now. There's no patrolling, there's no proactive policing, there's none of that. We don't even have a traffic division. They just restarted it. They had the highest level of traffic fatalities ever in Portland last year because they removed the traffic division. So everything that has happened has been backwards and made things worse. And the easiest, simplest, cheapest intervention it would have been is to get those officers training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu around the country. And where that's happened, one of our coaches from SBG trains the Pasadena Police Department. And you can look at the data from Pasadena and you see the use of force incidents just drop way down. Officers being injured drops way down. Cases of people resisting arrest drops way. All of it, everything becomes better and safer, even for the attorneys at the city. It's less liability. So you have to kind of try and get the message out to them that it's a win-win for everybody to have these guys training.
And do you have an opinion on the use of guns for self-defense? A lot of your people come to you for self-defense. Do they also have guns? What do you recommend about that?
Yeah, I'm definitely an advocate of the Second Amendment. I'm definitely an advocate of people's right to defend themselves. I'm not an extremist on it, but I do think it's important. And when we live in a country that has more handguns than people, I don't think that's going to change tomorrow. I think you could outlaw all guns tomorrow. And then the only people that won't be carrying will be the good people, which is not going to be good for anybody. So I do think that they can be good. I carry sometimes, my wife carries, or, a lot of my students and other instructors will carry on a regular basis. And like anything else, you have to be, if you're going to carry a tool, which is all a gun is, whether it's a knife or a gun or anything else, you have to really put the training time in with it. And you have to be, very responsible about how you handle situations, very responsible about what you allow yourself to get pulled into and not pulled into, because now you have a weapon on your person. Just like with a police officer, well, they'll say unarmed, but there's always a gun involved in an altercation between a police officer and somebody else because it's his own. And like happened in Ferguson, if the person reaches for it, that becomes a life or death encounter, that battle over that weapon. So you need to be able to hold on to that weapon. You need to be able to know when to draw and how. You need training. So as long as somebody's responsible, law-abiding citizen and they want to put the time in training, I'm all for it. I don't think it's a catch-all solution to self-defense or violence for a lot of different reasons. And one of them is a story I tell in the book. It's a very sad story, but a woman that came to me for training who was in a wheelchair, and she had very limited movement. And she'd been assaulted and groped and pushed over like half a dozen times here in Portland. And at first, when she told me that, I was kind of shocked, especially at the time, because just statistically, it didn't make any sense. But then I realized immediately she's a magnet for that kind of trash. They see her somewhere where there's there's a certain type of human, when they see her and there's no witnesses around, is immediately going to go over and try and assault her because she looks like she's an easy victim. And we talked about her having a gun, but the problem was her ability to hold it and even her confidence level. She felt like she would be compromised. And with something like pepper spray, also not necessarily a bad idea, but she's in a wheelchair, and how fast can she get around? So in her particular situation, my advice for her and what I felt the best option was a dog, to get a big dog and have that dog go with her everywhere she goes. And I hope she did, because that would be kryptonite for that kind of, for those kind of predators. But so in the right circumstances, with the right training and a lot of responsibility, I think handguns can definitely be, or firearms in general can definitely be part of the solution.
Yeah, I've written a fair amount about this and have largely given up on reducing the gun violence by very much, because there's just so many guns.
Yeah.
The law of large numbers, even if it's just 0.001% of people that are whack jobs, that's enough for every day to be some crazy shooting. And we're not going to take the guns away.
Nope.
And if the Second Amendment was somehow canceled, which is never going to happen, and they tried to collect the guns, you'd have Waco every weekend
Exactly right.
because people are not going to do that. That's another one of those cases that I couldn't figure out why the government responded the way it did. David
That would've
Koresh used to go into town
Yeah.
fairly regularly to get a haircut, go shopping, whatever. Why didn't they just pick him up there? They knew they were stockpiling weapons. Why would you risk that?
Yeah, that was a mess, and there was no reason for that to go down the way it did. And I think we can all look at that in hindsight and see it. I think the sheriff just said he could have just waited till he came into town and just arrested him there. Problem solved. They had kids inside that compound. So, but yeah, when you talk about things like school shootings, because I'll get asked about that a lot as well. You're not going to be able to take guns off the street to prevent school shootings in America. You could pass all the legislation tomorrow you want to. If we want to protect schools, then we have to handle it the same way we handle everything we truly want to protect. When we truly want to protect something, our courthouse or anything else, we control entry, and you control entries and exits, and that's one of the most important things you can do. And it doesn't mean you have to turn a school into a prison, but it does mean I should not be able to go downtown Portland, walk in through a side door of a school without any teachers or any other administrators stopping me and asking me for ID and walk down the hallway. That shouldn't happen. And by controlling access and the entry points, I think you can solve the problem a lot. Look what we did after 9/11. I mean, people were talking about arming pilots and putting officers on every flight, a lot of impractical solutions. What did they do? They hardened the cockpit doors. That was the first thing they did. They made it, and then they changed the habit of the pilots so that, they weren't coming out and going to the bathroom or having flight attendants going to give them coffee. They put the thing up and then line, and then they have a protocol for coming in and out. So that once that door is locked, unless they use that protocol for the person to go to the bathroom, it is locked, and you're not going to kick it down when you're flying. And we haven't had an attack like that since. That was the smartest, most practical thing to do.
Yeah, people respond in the craziest ways. There was also a surge in sales of parachutes that executives in high rises could have so they could jump out if their building gets hit by a plane. It's just insane. All right, so you have some other things you could do to respond. Things to look for as signs of potential attack. 1, they're closing in on you. 2, coordinating their movement with one or multiple other people. I guess that you mean that are closing in on you.
Yeah.
Hiding their hands, looking out for potential witnesses, self-grooming, or weight shifting. All right, so explain those.
Yeah, the way these guys operate in almost every circumstance is very similar. So they pick out a victim, they find the victim, they're either going to attack immediately or they're going to go through some kind of interview process or maybe attempt to distract you or whoever they've targeted. And when they come over, they're going to be fidgeting. They're going to be looking around for witnesses, looking around who's watching. Is there anybody watching right now? Is there a police officer right there? And so there's just kind of like this nervous demeanor and looking around. And then grooming is any kind of physical motion you make, an attempt to look natural that's not natural. So stepping back, putting things to do with their hands up here. So all of that usually precedes punching the other person in the face or tackling them. So they don't just walk up, put their hands up and punch. But they're nervous, they're looking, and then you see some sort of grooming behavior, and very often they'll blade themselves, they'll put their strong side back because they're going to hit with that punch. And that is the sign where it's time to get physical, whether that means getting away or getting close or fighting or whatever the circumstance calls for. But you're very late in the process with that predator at that point. They're on you, and then you will have gone from doubt and worry into true fear, which true fear, as Gavin de Becker rightly says, is a biological feeling you get in the face of an actual threat. It's not an imagined threat. There's an actual threat here in front of you. And that's the point where I think that true fear is going to start to kick in. And it should, because those are all the things you need, to be aware of. This person has bad intentions.
And usually they're there to just steal your wallet, or is it just they just want to be violent for violence sake?
It depends. One of the things I talk about quite a bit in the book is, I think, anybody who's looked at the data. So the first thing I did when I went to write this book, besides read a lot of the other stuff on the market, was look at just the raw data. The Bureau of Justice Statistics, the FBI, the CDC on homicides. There's a lot of it available, Washington Post database on shootings. But I think anybody that just looks at the data, just take 30 minutes and go and look at the data over however long a period, because it's pretty consistent. the last 3 years to the last 30 years. If you look at it and you think about it, I think you will draw the conclusion that at the heart of most problematic violence, most being the largest category in a plurality, are issues of immaturity. And these are issues of a lack of impulse control, self-awareness, and empathy. The most likely time to be attacked and the most likely age for your attacker will be between the ages of 17 and 22. And then there's a massive drop-off as it starts to come to 23 and 24, and it goes down here. And about half of what we see, especially when we see shootings, fully 50%, are fatherless young men murdering other fatherless young men over issues of status. It's not about a lot of money. It's not even necessarily about the drug trade. It's status. You disrespected me. You looked at me the wrong way. Something like that. And the solution to that disrespect that's culturally appropriate is violence. And then that's what it turns to. And that's almost half. If you took all the shootings out in a year that are of that category, you would immediately cut about half of them off. Yes, there's jealous husbands, and yes, there's armed robberies that go wrong, and there's banks that get robbed and shootouts, and there's drug deals that go bad. But those are all the little categories of what's left. And the biggest thing and the biggest issue I think we're going to have to deal with as a society and understand is we're going to have to come up with some solutions for that group of young men. Otherwise, we're all going to be in trouble. The only short-term solution to that problem is more police and locking up the repeat offenders, because it's a small percentage of that population that continually repeats the same crimes. But long-term, and that's not, my book's not a public policy book, but long-term, I think we need to have a conversation about why that's happening, and we have to be able to acknowledge that that's happening, and see if we can come up with some solutions for it, because it's not happening now. It seems, unfortunately, I hate to be pessimistic, but at least in the short term, I think everything is looking not good for my city and not good for what I see around the country.
Yeah, Portland. I used to love going to Portland, do book signings at Powell's. I'm never going there again now, I guess. Well, so the question is, well, one thing, I do hope optimistically this is just a little blip in the radar, the BLM movement and then COVID and, the Ferguson effect and, this kind of pulling back, defund the police. Hopefully, within a decade, we'll be back to where we were, say, in 2015 or so, before it all turned south. But so I was going to say what was I going to say? I forgot. Oh, I was going to give another conversation in your book you provide that I think is really useful because with homelessness increasing, we all encounter beggars, right? So here's the conversation that you should have. So when you are approached by somebody and they go, "Hey man, you got $1?" Your response should just be no. Or you could just ignore them, I guess. And then maybe they say, "Come on, man, I just saw you leave the store. You got to have change." He has now failed to respond to the word no. That's the beginning of a problem. No, would you leave me alone, please? So you've asked them a question. And then he said, "No, come on, man, just $1? No, back off." That's step 2. You've now issued a command. And then the third one, if they still pursue, back the fuck off now. And that usually does it. I've only had to do that once here in Santa Barbara. We do have some homeless, not too bad here. But when, one guy just kept pushing and pushing, and I was with my wife and son, I just put myself between him and I just got right up in his face, and then he left.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's a bit of an escalation game on their part, I guess, to see how far they can get.
That's actually, that particular exercise that I wrote down, exactly like we do there, is something that we physically act out when I do self-defense workshops for people. So I'll go places and, there's not a lot I can teach someone realistically in a day or 2 days. I'm not pretending somebody's going to be able to walk out of there and be able to fight. But what I can do is give people a lot of the information in the book, things to look for, not look for, and then act out some of these scenarios and help teach people how to be assertive. And a lot of people have trouble doing what you just did, saying that out loud, especially women. A lot of women have been raised in a way where they're told to be polite, and they haven't had the kind of experience doing that. So physically, both men and women, but physically acting that out and practicing that. And that goes back to what I was talking about with the kids. It's no different from what we do with the kids. With the kids, it's talk, tell, tackle. And here we're You're ask, tell, make. You're going to ask them with politeness to cease whatever they're doing, and then you're going to tell them that they need to stop that. And if you've gotten to that point of tell and it continues, that is a signal that this is a predator, because anybody, when you say no to anybody and they don't accept that no, that's a problem. You have a problem. And so you're going to need to, make space or stand your ground and let this individual know that you're not going to be a victim. And I can't tell exactly what the right answer between those two always will be for everybody. Circumstances will dictate that. Tactics will change upon contact, but the general formula is the same. And also just learning how to talk to people in the street. One of the things I talk about in the book as well is, the old really bad advice people would give kids of not talking to strangers, which doesn't make any sense or work because kids have to talk to strangers all the time. What you want to do is teach your kids how to talk to strangers. And people who have a hard time being assertive, even as adults, one of the things I tell them to do is practice having conversations with random people you meet in the street. Your person who gives you the coffee, your Uber driver, whoever it is. So you just become more comfortable with that, verbally engaging with other people in a manner that's polite but assertive and radiates a certain confidence. And it's a skill set. It's a skill set you can practice just like you can practice jiu-jitsu. And then if you get in a situation like you were in where somebody's pushing their boundaries, you're going to be more apt to pull that off. When you tell them to back the fuck off now, they're probably going to back the fuck off now. And the vast majority of cases, they will.
So the impulse you're trying to override there is our tendency to want to be nice.
Yeah.
And we know there's homeless people. You don't want to, you want to do something to help. I liked your little line, but just save the $5 and give it to a charity.
Yeah.
But, it's hard when the guy's there with his hand out. We have a McDonald's right next door. And, when I first moved into the office here, the guy was asking me, have you got, $1 or $2? Or, and I gave him one of my 2 sausage egg McMuffins. And then, of course, that only reinforced the point that, the next day, hey, how about a Happy Meal?
There you go. Yeah.
And it's like, all right. So how about just no? Or now I just kind of keep my head down and just walk past whoever happens to be there. Sometimes they have a sign, please help or whatever, and it's hard at the end of the freeway off ramp. There they are. You kind of hope that the light doesn't turn red when you're the first car there next to the guy, because I guess, we have a nature that we want to be nice and helpful, but don't want to be exploited.
Yeah, I've definitely been a sucker for that as well in my life. And then what changed my opinion on that is having multiple conversations with police officer friends of mine who they would see me engage in those kind of situations in various places and then explain to me why long-term that's a bad strategy. And what we're actually doing is we're making it easier for them to be in a position where they're more likely to be hurt. Anything that we do to try and make it more comfortable for them to sleep on the sidewalk is the wrong answer, because sleeping on the sidewalk is not good for people. The level of violence that they're going to be exposed to and everything else. You need to have the resources. And we spend so much money on those resources. I don't even remember what they were spending per year in San Francisco per homeless person, but there's a enormous amount of money that we are pouring into the system, whether it's effective or not effective. What I will say is there are programs there. So here in Portland, anybody that wants to get off the street can get off the street. If they're hungry, there's places they can go to eat. If they need somewhere to sleep because it's cold, there are places they can go to sleep. There are places they can go to get counseling. There are places they can go to get job training. Their resources are there. So anything we do to make it easier for them not to take advantage of those resources and just sit on the corner taking fentanyl isn't long-term a compassionate solution. So I think sometimes people just have to wrap their mind around that, and you're not doing them any favors either.
Why are so many of them not taking advantage of those social services? Is it mental illness, or it's a rational choice and it's cheaper and more efficient to beg?
Yeah, it's both. I mean, everybody wants to assume the best of people. And when we think homelessness, we always think of a family or somebody that lost their job and they had a terrible bout of luck and now they're on the street and they need help. And all of us want to help somebody like that, right? We all want to do that. But the reality is, when you drive around Portland or if you do ride-alongs with the police officers and you meet them, a vast majority are hardcore drug addicts, and a certain percentage as well are severely mentally ill. And the ones who are very mentally ill, oftentimes they won't cooperate with the halfway houses, or they'll leave And the drug addicts don't want to go to the shelters or go do any of that because they have to get clean. You can't take fentanyl if you're in the homeless shelter. And the truth is, they want to sleep on the sidewalk and take fentanyl. That's what they want to do. And so for some of them, it's actually a conscious choice. It's a life decision. And I'm sure they've suffered immensely to get a point where they've made that decision. But either way, they're not looking to get off the street. They're looking to stay on the street and do drugs. And so we're going to have to confront that eventually as a society. And to do that, we have to look at it and see it for what it is. There's a lot of the homeless encampments here in Portland are basically just drug camps. There are 5 or 6 people that get together, put a tent around, and they're buying, selling, and using drugs all day long. And then the petty crime that is involved with all that to be able to afford to buy the drugs. That's a huge percentage of what we have going on, though. It's not just people who are down on their luck. Those are the minority. They're the minority of that group, the people who truly don't want to be homeless and are temporarily homeless. They're the minority of the group that we see every day on the street.
Yeah. I was wondering, because we have that down in LA too. I used to ride along the bike paths along the rivers, like Santa Ana River Trail, San Gabriel River Trail, and so on. Now there's homeless encampments along the way. And do they, because it's better weather here, I always wonder, do they talk amongst themselves, like, hey, it's much better in LA, let's all go up there. And furthermore, they have handouts or whatever, we can get showers or bathrooms, something like that.
Oh, they definitely do. And, I've talked to a lot of the homeless people around. I've had conversations with them, both with police officers and just on my own. And they'll tell you if you go up there, and a lot of them are very honest, and they'll just tell you, yeah, I'm here to do the drugs, and Portland's a great place to get drugs. And if I need this, I can go here. And they know where all the resources are. And the resources are in many ways what draws them here. It was funny because we had a proposed solution, which thankfully didn't get a vote. But they wanted to give $1,000 a month additional to people who were sleeping on the street in Portland. And I was just thinking to myself, you have no idea what's going to happen a month or a week after you pass up. Everybody that's in San Francisco and Seattle is going to migrate to Portland because it's $1,000 more worth of fentanyl that they can get. And it's just these well-intentioned but not well thought out policies that tend to make the problem worse because people, I don't think of everything that's going to go along with that.
Yeah. I remember what I was going to say when we were talking about the motivation for evil and violence. Roy Baumeister's book, Evil, where he interviewed a lot of those guys on death row and for murder and rape and so on. And it was like, to a man, and they're all men, they all felt like the victim deserved to die. And they all had their perfectly rational reason. Oh, she cheated on me, or he cheated on me in cards, or he took my parking spot, or he dissed me or insulted me in front of my girlfriend and so on. They all had reasons. And it wasn't due to lack of self-esteem, which was, popular in the 90s. And just the opposite. They were very high in self-esteem. They felt quite high. And, then I was also reading Donald Black's paper on self-help justice. What do you call it? Violence as self-help justice, something like that. Again, most of these young men are dispersing what they consider to be a form of justice.
Yeah.
The police department's not going to take care of me, or it's an illegal drug trade, so you can't sue the guy for standing on your street corner, right? So you got to go there middle of the night and get your justice, and a lot of it's that way. So I'm wondering what you think about let's go to a root cause. Why are these young men doing this? You mentioned fatherlessness. Do we have theories and research that shows there is a correlation between fatherlessness and teenage, young 20s violence?
Yes, there's a massive body of literature that shows that. And I took a deep dive into that literature, and I read about it quite a bit in the book. But to be honest with you, I leaned towards that conclusion before I ever read the literature, because you can control for it and you can see the difference. So when you look at the crime rates, there's no way getting around how different groups have massively different rates of crime. And so you can control for poverty, you can control for unemployment, you can control for age, control for all these different factors, and you'll still see this large gap difference. The moment you start to control for out-of-wedlock birth rates, it starts to match up, and it matches up almost perfectly. And I know that doesn't mean that it's the reason, but it definitely points to that reason. And I think there's been lots of studies since then that have proven that that's the reason. And I think boys, young men, learn how to behave properly, how to treat women, how to interact with other men, how to defend their boundaries and properly and improperly from their fathers. And if you remove fathers from the home and you have no positive male role models around them, they gather together in groups and then they go out and cause mayhem. I tell a story in the book when I was in South Africa many years ago. I was at Pilanesberg National Park, and they had a rash of rhinos being mutilated and killed. And at first, they couldn't quite figure out what it was. Of course, the first thought is poachers, but they weren't taking the horns. And there's not many things that can kill a rhino. And what they discovered is that young male elephants had gathered together, basically in gangs, and were chasing these rhinos, torturing them, and killing them. And what had happened was they had taken a group of rhinos from Kruger National Park, and they'd put them into Pilanesberg, but the straps on the helicopters weren't heavy enough to carry the male bulls. So they had brought the women, and they had brought a lot of young men and smaller male elephants, but none of the bulls. And no matter what they did, they just had this problem of rampaging young elephants. And so then eventually they fixed the straps, bring the bull elephants in, drop them down in there, and the problem solves itself within a couple months. And obviously humans aren't elephants, but I do think that that basic principle carries over. And the literature, I think.
Well, yeah, and I agree with that. What's the causal mechanism behind that? Okay, let's think about this. Adrian Rain, you talk about him. In your book, I read his Anatomy of Violence book.
Mm-hmm.
He's the guy that did the brain scans on these serial killers and so on. Basically, they're all just libido and id, and there's no break. The prefrontal cortex is largely quiescent.
Right.
And so something like having a structured home environment, not just a father, but a good marriage and, a solid, consistent family with a nice neighborhood without gangs and sports to release a lot of that male energy and so on, is a way of dampening those libidinal impulses that bubble up. And it's not that you and I have these impulses to kill and rape and murder and torture people, but those got kind of normed out of us much earlier. So there has to be something along those lines.
Yeah. I think when young men are at that dangerous age, when they start to hit puberty, and like when I became violent, 12 to 13, that's when a lot of it starts. We're in a search for identity. We're trying to find out what it means to be who we are and what it means to be a man and what men do and what men don't do, and respect as a male. And in a complete absence of mature male role models, then we gather together, and nothing good comes from that, unfortunately.
I just had Heather McDonald on the podcast, her book Race and Merit.
Yeah.
And she has written books on cops, the war on cops and so on. Okay, she's conservative, but she makes some good arguments.
She makes very good
I say that because I'm not conservative, but she does follow the data.
Yeah.
And, so she points out that in 1963, I think it was, when Daniel Patrick Moynihan released his study of the 25% rate of fatherless homes in the African-American community across the United States, and he was sounding the alarm. And she says that the rate is now like 3 times that, right? It's close to 75% now.
Yeah.
And so she thinks that's one of the deeper root causes of black on black crime, which is not politically correct. It's taboo to talk about that now, but it's real. And if Black Lives Matter, you have to address that problem.
Yeah, it's real, and it's about half of all our violence in this country, about 50%. I think she's right on that. I actually quote that from the Moynihan report in the book, and that's a whole nother big topic that would require a whole book to write about. But anybody that goes back and looks at the data, you will see it looks fairly stable, and then you hit the very early 60s in 1963, and something happens. Now, what happens in 1963? I don't know. There can be a lot of conversations about what happened there. There could be birth control, and there's all kinds of other things that could go on. But I also think that was the beginning of the welfare state, and there may have been some economic incentives that helped destroy nuclear family and two-parent homes, and I think that has devastating effects on violence. And you can predict how much violence you're going to have within a given community if you know the out-of-wedlock birth rates and how many kids between a certain age, males without fathers in their home, live in that particular area. You can predict it fairly accurately, and there's not many arguments against it. The main one that I would run into, and I read a lot and I've heard, which is a very popular one with people more of the left, is to come back and reference Scandinavia. And I say, well, what about Sweden? Swedes don't get married. They don't get married the same way. And I talk about this in the book as well, but that's just a basic misunderstanding about Scandinavian culture. My wife's Icelandic, but if we talk about Sweden just in particular, it's really only about 3% of households with young children where both the biological father and biological mother aren't living together with that child to a certain age. So Swedes are actually fairly conservative people. And once they have kids, they tend to live together and raise the child together, and the father is present in the child's life. They don't get legally married in the sense that we do here, but they don't need to get legally married in the sense that we do here because the way their laws work and they cohabitate with each other, they wind up getting all the same kind of things we would get in America from marriage. So it's just a basic misunderstanding of Scandinavian culture. And then if you go and you control for that and you look for where's the violence in Sweden, where's the violence in these communities, it's with that 3%. It's with that small population. And this holds true around the world.
This is one of those policy issues that's difficult to know what to do because the government can't force people to get married.
No.
Right? But you can give tax breaks for marriage and tax breaks for having children, and you get to I get to deduct the mortgage interest on my loan and so on. That's the government saying, we like that you're married, having kids, and owning a home, but you can't force people to do it, right? So it has to come from the bottom up through norm changes.
I agree 100%. Through culture. Through culture. We have to value mothers and value fathers and value taking care of your kids and raising your kids and put that up where it belongs as far as one of our primary duties as human beings, and give that the honor and respect it deserves, and just be really careful about not accidentally creating economic incentives which may take away some of those fathers from being in the homes with the mom.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about some of these police videos, like the Rodney King beating. I read a sociologist describing this as a forward panic, almost as if like a shark feeding frenzy, or the wolves going after the prey, and they just kind of lose all frontal cortex control, and you just get out of control. It looks like that in the Rodney King beating. Some of these other more recent police videos, it looks like that just something snaps because of the panic or the adrenaline, or I don't know what. But I haven't read much about that. I don't really know if there's anything neurophysiological to that.
Well, yeah, we had a recent case. I can't remember what the name of it, but within the last year, where we had a bunch of police officers, everybody involved pretty much was black, which we had a group of black police officers pulled over a black suspect and then beat the daylights out of him. And it was caught on video, and people were filming it from across the street, and they're literally holding him up and punching him. And that was one of those egregious cases of police violence where these guys definitely need to go to jail. And there's a couple things from that. One was they had just gone on a long chase with this guy, which is usually that's what happened with the Rodney King situation. Rodney King's slightly different, but there's a much longer video that the vast majority of Americans never got to see. They just saw that one particular.
Yeah, I saw that.
And what preceded that video was him driving like a maniac through a residential section and getting these guys chasing him. And what happens when you chase other people is your adrenaline starts to go up, and all of a sudden you get out of the car and your adrenaline's surging. And this guy gets out of the car, and then they start fighting with you. And then, instinct takes over, and pack mentalities can set in. And even educated people and police officers can get caught up in that kind of mob. It's one of the reasons why mobs are so dangerous. You get caught up in that kind of action and engage in behavior that you otherwise might never engage in if you were alone or just with a couple other people. That's clearly what I think happened in the case. The officers pulled that guy over. But when I first saw it, the first thing it looked like it was a gang beating. And I went back and I looked at the backgrounds of some of those officers. Most of those officers had been hired within the last year or 2 years. And some of the standards, because some of the departments are having a hard time getting getting good officers to apply. I mean, nobody in their right mind would want to come be a police officer in Portland where the citizens are going to be throwing condoms filled with feces at you and screaming at you. And if you go out and make an arrest, even if it's a righteous arrest, likely just to call you a pig and a racist. Like, who wants to work in that community? So it becomes hard to then get good candidates. And so what do? They lower the standards. And so you have guys now that are getting hired in some of these departments who are convicted felons and who have gang membership. And this goes back to Rampart as well, if we go back to Los Angeles. But the gangs are great actually at getting their own people into the department. If you lower the standards enough, they will sneak people in there who have gang affiliation, which is what happened. It's part of what happened in the Rampart scandal. And I think, it's my speculation on the case, and I haven't read much about it since, but I think that particular incident with those officers is probably something like that. But big picture, yeah, you get involved in a chase and your adrenaline's going and you've been chasing somebody by the car and driving around 10 minutes and all of a sudden you both jump out. Like, everybody's adrenaline is surging. And this is when, it's more apt for somebody to get hurt.
Yeah. Okay, last question on this general topic. Sexual violence and rape. Why do men do this? What are the different theories about it?
Yeah, there are lots of different theories about rape. And I'm not exactly sure, to be honest with you, what the actual reasons are. I mean, obviously, from an evolutionary standpoint, if we go down to the selfish gene model, I think that would probably be the most basic element of it. But what I try and focus on in the book is the self-defense aspect of it. So what do women need to be aware of? What do women need to look for? And men, but primarily women, and how to handle themselves in those particular situations. But again,
give us a couple of pointers there for our listeners.
Well, the big thing I think to keep in mind, and this goes for all violence, but it's particularly true of rape, is that the vast majority of violence is committed by people that we know. This is true of homicides. This is true of assaults. It's true of everything. So a lot of the self-defense literature, the books and the videos you'd see online about self-defense put a heavy emphasis on the stranger, the guy in the ski mask in the parking garage who's coming to get you. And I get that, and that exists, and we want to be able to defend ourselves from that. But the reality is, most of the time, it's going to be somebody you know. And this is particularly true of rape. It's going to be a date. It's going to be a boyfriend. And when you see half the women who are murdered in this country are killed by a husband or former lover, and in almost every one of those cases, there was a long series of stalking that preceded it, where this guy was stalking them. And they oftentimes have made multiple police reports about it, and sometimes have even gotten a restraining order. But there's a progression that these guys make. And so the sooner you can see this predator, recognize the predator in sheep's clothing, then the better you are to make distance and avoid the whole situation to begin with. I mean, if it turns physical, if somebody's trying to hold a woman down and rape her, there is no art on planet Earth that's going to help her defend herself in that situation better than Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because by definition, she's going to be on the ground. And from a grappling perspective, she'll probably be on the ground in a position that for us is not that bad. When you have somebody between your legs when you're on your back, you can choke them and break their arm and do different things to them if they're skilled. So it's the perfect art for somebody being pinned down, for somebody being held, which goes back to, if you're not being pinned down and you're not being held, why are you fighting? Right? If I can get away, and if you're not a police officer and you're not protecting yourself or someone else, in most situations, if you can make space and get away, you would want to. But if you are being held down and if you can't get away, it's because someone's grabbed you and they're holding you in place, and that's where grappling comes in. So the physical solution is submission grappling, but the big solution long term is to patrol your relationships. And I talk a lot about what I call character disordered people in the book, because these people who who wind up eventually becoming violent criminal actors and becoming the attackers, they don't start out as violent criminal actors. They start out as character disordered individuals who also give off certain traits that you'll be able to recognize, continually push boundaries, continually refuse to take no for an answer, and then push and push and push until they feel like they've got you just at the right spot to where, and they have the opportunity, and then it becomes an attack. And recognizing the people like that are in your life and calling them from your relationships is the single best thing. It's like, just pick one thing somebody can do, a woman and anyone can do to be safe. It's like not having those kind of men in your bubble is super important. And so that just goes back to being able to recognize them and listening, not rationalizing away those thoughts about what's happening in the moment, and trying to apply good intentions all the time to someone who may very well have bad intentions.
Is it your sense that those signs are probably there early enough to do something about it, get this guy out of your life before it gets to a situation where he could commit violence?
100%.
But that most women just ignore it because they want to be nice or friendly or whatever.
Yeah. Want to be nice, don't want to think that about them. There's lots of different reasons. Hoping it stops, hoping they go away, hoping if they comply a little bit, they'll just cease. A litany of different things that could go on in someone's head that prevents them from just positively asserting their boundaries and then defending it. But at the end of the day, that's what's going on. And I'm not saying it never occurs that all of a sudden a guy will come out and grab a woman in a parking lot and throw her in a car and try and rape her. That can happen too, and happens sometimes. But that's not the majority of cases. Vast majority of cases, like I say, it's people that people that you interact with, people that will talk to you, people you're going to have a conversation with, people that you're engaging socially with. And that is a good thing in a way, because that's what gives us a chance to realize who these people are. Good thing that those kind of predators that just all of a sudden strike from the shadows that you never see are the small minority.
I think it's probably good advice not to follow Hollywood movies of how to fight. I was just watching Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where the Manson character, Tex Watson, comes at Brad Pitt with a knife, a big old huge knife, and Pitt blocks it and then knocks the knife into the guy's leg, and it's just like, how hard is that got to be to do?
It's a great movie.
Totally.
Yeah, violence is very rarely done well in movies.
It's terrible. One of the Mythbusters episodes was, could you actually shoot a gun out of somebody's hand and they just kind of wave it off like that?
Right.
No.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true.
It's crazy. All right, Matt, The Gift of Violence, Practical Knowledge for Surviving and Thriving in a Dangerous World. Everybody should read this book. I mean, it's really important. We don't like to think that that's the world we live in, but it is. Even if it was a near perfect world, it's never going to be zero. So thank you for your work and what you're doing. And where can people find you online in your gym?
Thank you, Michael. It's been an honor to be here. StraightBlastGym.com is the website for our organization. You can find our locations around the world. My website, mattthornton.org, just my name.org. And then they can purchase the book on wherever books are sold, Amazon, Barnes & Noble.
Yeah, nice. So, and just as when you join, what happens? You go into the gym once a week or once a day, or what do you
come in? We're going to interview you. We're going to find out what you're really interested in and what why you're really training and what you want to get out of training. And then we're going to have you train a couple days a week. We keep it to 2 days a week because people sometimes tend to do too much in the beginning and burn themselves out or get sore and in a way that they're not used to. So we kind of moderate what you're allowed to do for the first 6 to 8 weeks. And then after about 3 months, we try and work you back into the gym as a whole, at which point you'll create your own schedule and train however you want. And hopefully at that point, you'll wind up loving it. But I think the big thing for people to know is it's for everybody. I've got students in their 70s. I've got kids that are 4 and 5, males, females. It's safe. You're not going to get hurt if you go to a good school, and you're going to make great friends because you'll all of a sudden exposed to another social group of people who aren't creeps.
I want to do this in Santa Barbara. I wonder if there's a place here that does something like that.
There's a bunch of them in your area. You want some good places to train, just let me know. I'll send you.
Okay. All right. Yes. Well, let's do that.